Protests in California over immigration, ICE. It was really chaotic over the weekend. Things seem like they're heating up, especially along the southern border of California. Lucas, we talked about this a bit when we had our first episode on Trump declaring war on the United States with respect to starting to go after judges who were employing immigrants, illegal immigrants, or maybe the immigration status isn't 100% determined in a lot of those cases. But now we have the National Guard being mobilized in California, Governor Newsom firing back. It seems like this is pretty consequential and related to what we had talked about before. So, what have you been seeing that's interesting to you, and what's your take on this?
Well, so while this is going on, I've been rereading a history of the continental cons of the the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, and it's interesting to me that the first argument that they attack in the summer in which they're writing the Constitution is whether the federal government is going to be a national government or not. And we have a narrative about federalism or anti-federalism today, but it was decided very quickly then that the states would retain their national powers. And those powers of nationalism are about those people who are born there. Nation is French for to be born. Nacio in Spanish. National means that the government has control over the people, not just over the commerce. So we've seen that balance of power shift through the history of the United States, and the federal government gradually assuming more and more national controls. They've always had, the Constitutional Convention actually ends with a discussion of where the seat of the federal government would be, and it was decided 10 miles by 10 miles in a location yet to be decided that would eventually be given up by Virginia and Maryland. But the representatives at the Constitutional Convention say, "Ooh, my gosh, the federal government, there will be a national government. Oh my, the corruption." So think about that with regards to January 6th, which also brings some interesting bears interesting relations to these riots that are going on in California. So that's in a broader context. I think that's part of the arc and the tension between federal and state governments. And I had every expectation to see some states, and especially blue states like New Mexico and California, states that are formerly of northern Mexico, that we took from them in a war that we started in 1850, right before the Civil War. I'm not surprised to see them pushing back the most. So it's not just about the crowds of rioters who are pushing back against ICE and the federal government. The federal government is ICE is a finger of the federal government, but there are questions as to whether they have any business touching any of the bodies that reside in the state of California. And it seems that Gavin Newsom is pushing back on that quite a bit. And the question is, will the federal government turn all the way to arresting some of these members of the government, and especially the governor of California? Who knows? But bearing all of that in mind, the thing that it has also...
Well, wait, that's a pretty hot take. Do you think that it's going to go that far? Will President Trump actually make a move against the governor of the most populous, most donating state in the union?
Well, already he's sending in the National Guard. And the National Guard, we should also bear in mind the history of the National Guard. Where does it come from? The National Guard comes after the Civil War. And leading into the Civil War, if we remember how that actually played out, there were state militias, and some of the state militias were not under the thumb of the federal government. Maryland, top of the list. And because of the coming out of the Civil War, because politicians looked back on it and realized that they needed to have some measure of control, they created the National Guard. And that was to dole out money and pay, and also training, and have some sort of expectation of a of a more cohesive federal force. But again, also listen to the name of it, the National Guard. That speaks to the national powers of the state constitutions. Those were the national governments.
And those were all brought under the guise of the army. I mean, there is no National Guard anymore. We call it National Guard, but that's just a branch of the army. So it's not like this is some independent power that's controlled by the states. It hasn't been that in a super long time.
And it would be interesting to hear from members of the National Guard as to what the rhetoric is as to who they answer to. If we ask members of our fighting forces, the Marines, and Rusty, you can confirm or deny this, but yeah, the Navy, the Air Force, whatever it may be, they will say that they answer to the Constitution, which is a very interesting answer. Um, but I would say that they answer up their chain of command is more the de facto of what occurs.
Yeah,
And
that would be my considering answer. Would be they listen to the chain of command, and at the top of the chain of command is the president. He is the leader of all the armed forces of the United States, and so he basically has the overall control. I mean, and if the president basically told, well, I mean, when I was in the Marine Corps, if the president told me an order, I basically would have followed that as you know, as God's order, basically, and would have done what was needed. That's kind of just my mindset. And it's interesting when you talk about, the National Guard being called in to take care, or not take care, but to help out with these riots. I remember when I was in the Marine Corps, one of my gunnery sergeants, he was in during the first LA riots, and back of Rodney King, and he said he remembers them having to send him in to the LA riots as a Marine Corps to try to help calm down the situation. And then while I was enlisted, I was almost deployed to Katrina when they had the big issues and all the problems going down at Katrina. They almost called in the Marines to Katrina, but they ended up calling in the National Guard instead. And when I was also in the 2007 Republican National Convention, they called up the National Guard there to help out also with some of the not so much taking care of the protest, but just to help make sure the protest didn't get too out of hand.
well, and whenever government calls out, especially the National Guard, and even more so, the troops, are the United States military, it's often under sort of the aegis of providing aid rather than lethal force. But there's always the threat of lethal force that accompanies a military anywhere. Now, we also so this is where, and I'm glad you have Douglas McGregor and Larry Johnson pulled up. Colonel Douglas McGregor. Um, Douglas McGregor Colonel McGregor was an advisor to Trump's administration, and I forget what his title was in Trump's first administration. But here in this discussion he has with Larry Johnson, who is a former CIA analyst, and when I mentioned CIA, you said, Rusty, that in your to your understanding of the chain of command, the president's orders are the voice of God. But I think part of our problem is that there are people up the chain of command, especially those generals and upper level management in the military, in the Pentagon, who are not agreeing with the desires of the president. And McGregor lays out exactly that going on during Trump's first administration, and orders that were issued, as executive orders that were issued that were totally ignored by the Pentagon. And those orders were to the effect of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. And in this interview, McGregor talks about how his recommendation was for the troops to be removed in the middle of the winter, for all the nuances and the details that were in that executive order were absolutely ignored. And he says not only he said the executive order was with regards to withdrawing from Afghanistan, but Donald Trump had called him into his office and said, I want out of NATO, I want out of Afghanistan, I want out of Syria, I want I want our troops out of the rest of the world. And McGregor says that there was and I forget his name, but there was a representative from the Pentagon who has some squeaky voice, and McGregor does a great imitation of it, and says to McGregor, well, are there any real security threats? And McGregor says, yes, our southern border. And so you can hear or you can understand the calculus that McGregor is making here in, okay, if the political winds of the United States and the Pentagon rely on there being a military, one way of getting us out of foreign entanglements is to find a reason back home to call the troops back home. And we have seen.
So is that the lead in here, that we have this drug crisis which is happening, or that's being called out with fentanyl, that's happening on the southern border with Mexican gangs, and we've got the immigration issue coming up? Is that where we're going with this, or help me connect the dots?
Well, sure. So now let's fast forward to Trump administration too. In the campaign, there was a lot about immigration in their talking points. It was the foremost issue, rather than foreign wars or the economy, and also the talking point in the campaign was only immigrants who've been breaking the law. But that changed immediately. The press secretary, the words that she closed with in her first address to the press, Caroline Levitt, was that anyone who entered the country without the correct papers had broken the law, and they were all on the table for deportation. And whether or not the Trump administration has been meeting that in numbers, or if this has largely been theater, they have been unrelenting in their they have not bowed their heads towards sanctuary cities, to the power of state and local governments, and have been very, very open and confrontational on the immigration issue. And so that leads me to thinking that in the minds of the Trump cabinet, or the Trump's advisors, is an understanding that if Trump and the Trump MAGA, whomever it may be, if like-minded people in his administration do want to pull our troops out of foreign entanglements, then the best way to do so is to have a reason to bring them home. And so sending out the National Guard, to me, is the first step. And the next step is to say, now we need the Marines, and we need the Army, and we need our other troops. And we need to station them along the southern border in the militarized zone that was created by, or that was remilitarized by Trump's first executive order.
And we also have some accusations that the drug crisis, the fentanyl crisis, has been exacerbated or completely enabled by the Chinese selling the precursor chemicals to making fentanyl to the Mexican cartels. What do you make of that?
So there is a lot of demonification of the Chinese by the Trump administration, by the Biden administration, by all American administrations. I'm not sure how warranted that demonification is, but I do believe that it is true that China makes many things, including chemicals that are used for the manufacture of drugs, and that they also care less about who's receiving them. And not only that, but China has every reason to hold a grudge against the United States. And it's not well known nor understood in the United States, but the but the old money of America, many of the large fortunes of everyone from the Astors to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Delanos, even the Roosevelts and the Sacklers, many of these big money New York City families made their money by selling opium in China. And the British and the American opium policies. Oh, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., by the way, is, well, that's a whole other story. But that's FDR's grandson, who was in charge of the CIA in no less than Syria after World War II. But the opium wars are sort of ended whenever there was internal conflict in the United States, but this is part of the in the United States, we like to talk about the Monroe Doctrine, and this notion of regional hegemony, regional power. But that doesn't really hold true to American past. American industrial families were very had a big hand in maintaining the opium trade in Asia, despite the wishes of the ruling class there that it not be facilitated. And it was the opium wars and the devastating effect of opium in China that led into their 100 years of humiliation, from which they recover today, and is the mainstream narrative of the arc of history of China. So that they would be supplying chemicals, and not necessarily fentanyl, but chemicals. And we also have to bear in mind that there are medical uses for fentanyl. So for them to turn to drape a Rawlsian veil over what they don't know about is no surprise to me. And I would say that they probably think of it in terms of, these are internal societal conflicts in America and they need to figure it out. And meanwhile, they ask us to make all these things for them. We're going to do it. But yes, long story short, fentanyl is coming into the United States through cartels, through Mexico. We also have issue with a lot of the munitions that we've been sending out to various factions in countries that we want to destabilize and have regime changes. Well, the cartels are very aware of those munitions going onto the market, and they bring them right back home. And then I should say, to cap all of that off, we need to think about these latest attacks that have gone on in Russia via Ukrainian drones. How feasible would it be for that to happen in the United States? I would say much more so than in Russia, because we have, and I may be wrong about this, but it would seem to me that with our free trade and sort of lackadaisical watch on products that are entering the United States, especially through Mexico, and trucks in Laredo and in south of San Diego and in Tijuana, that we could have any number of drones that could cause great devastation to the American homeland. And so in part, I think it warranted to be concerned in this war of, or in this world of enhanced guerrilla warfare tactics that drones bring to smaller nation states.
So we've got Trump with a reason to bring the troops home, and you think that this is going to escalate. So Gavin Newsom is lining up saying that this is inappropriate. He's threatening a lawsuit. Is there much more the states can do? I think that this was kind of a settled topic when the Civil War was fought. I don't know really what's going to happen here politically, but definitely we've got Gavin Newsom making some public statements that he doesn't like what's going on and is threatening whatever he can do here. But I feel like there's not a lot that can be done given the way that the federal government is set up to be in a position of superiority over the states.
Well, to go back to the Civil War again, I think about the two methods that states had been brought under the control, that their national powers have been thwarted by the federal government since the Civil War. And one way is through the dollar, and we know well here that the dollar was essentially created along with the nationalized banking system by Abraham Lincoln and Salmon P. Chase in 1861 and 1862, 1863, 1864, through various acts through those years. But the other thing coming out of the Civil War that had that impacted the West, and how the West was to be settled were the railroads. So it's through money and through corporations that I think about the real power that the federal government exerts on the states. Now, to the money side, we know that the federal government is long in the practice of denying states federal dollars, grants, or monies that are promised to them, however they may play out, if they don't play by the rules. But we're also seeing shaken confidence in the dollar, a growing awareness of maybe duplicity in how many dollars are made, or who dollars are promised to, both around the world and in states. So I see a waning of that of that bag of carrots that the federal government was able to use to keep states in line. And just maybe an example of that, like think about our 55 mile per hour speed limit that we had when we were growing up. That 55 mile an hour speed limit came in the wake of the Nixon shock, and the concerns about the how much energy we were going to have. And the federal government said, well, we need all of the states to drive slow. We need everybody in all the states to drive slower, so we won't dole out money for their roads, for the interstates or other road projects, unless they lower their speed limits. And the federal government does that in all sectors all the time. Now, we also have still more corporations and more corporate control than in the time of the railroads. That is something that has grown and manifested around the world. Some of those corporations with a lot of power are located in or are headquartered in San Francisco. Some of them are not. But when I think about the immigration issue, and I think about where corporations fall in what they would like to see, corporations would like to see more immigration. And I mean, we know well, corporations like to see more workers, more possibility for workers, and that has been something that the whatever we want to call it, the fascism or the autocracy or the nationalism of the Trump administration has been very concerned in stopping. I don't know, apart from appeals towards safety, and moving with the military, we're going to see, I think, a big pushback from corporations, and maybe less so with regards to tech companies, but agriculture, meat packing, companies that rely on a lot of unskilled or hand labor, I think are going to be hurt. I mean, not even counting into this the restaurant industry, and I think about how prolific it is for people who aren't working in corporate equity-backed America. Where are they working at?
Well, I mean, California definitely relies on a lot of migrant labor, so this is kind of a direct attack on California, as well as Trump's plan to pull funding for their high-speed rail. I mean, this is, Trump is basically setting up a big fight with the governor of California here, and I don't know if we really dealt on it too much, but he's planning whatever he can do as far as lawsuits and breaching state sovereignty. This is shaping up to be very much a blue state versus the Trump administration.
I mean, I think it's going to be more than a blue state because as these immigration effects are felt in rural America, I'm wondering how much of a pushback the Trump administration is going to get from agricultural producers. And when it comes to immigration, I often am of the mind that we when we talk about immigration, the concerns are usually with regards to Mexico or Venezuela or other countries in South America, maybe a little bit with China or India, much less so towards Canada. But when I was in Colorado and people complain about immigration, I'd say, yeah, we got a problem with people moving in from California and Connecticut and raising all of the gentrification from the boom in housing prices is not coming from Mexico. It's coming from within the United States. So again, I think this goes back to some questions about the balance of national states in a federal union is going to be something that we have to rethink because stopping immigration from Mexico is not stopping immigration from richer states into poorer states, and so those poor states are not going to be satisfied with sending out the military to close down the southern border.
So, is there anywhere else you wanted to take the conversation? I know that I flashed Kermit Roosevelt on the screen for a second. I think that was a premature link to bring up. So, how does that tie into it? Like, where do you see that part in the conversation going?
Well, I thought I threw in our little in my page of links Kermit because we talk about the deep state, we talk about the oligarchies of America, the ruling families, and no, maybe not no shade, but maybe just a little shade on FDR, on Teddy Roosevelt, on Eleanor Roosevelt. We talk today about the Bushes and the Clintons, but even the Bush family ties directly back into these New England blue blood swells, and nothing against the Bushes either, but we need to be aware as Americans that American foreign policy and domestic policy has often been managed or driven by commercial concerns. And Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was the grandson of FDR. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. was the head of the CIA. That whenever we talk about the issues that we have in the Middle East, some of those relationships were created and defined by Kermit Roosevelt, grandson of FDR, and I mean, even to push that dial further back, as the Trump administration leans heavily on McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt sent his Great White Fleet around the world as a threat to especially Asia, and that was coming out of the Civil War, out of the reconstruction of the United States, and he was announcing that, hey, the United States has recovered from our Civil War, and we're going to start taking advantage of foreign countries again. Africa and Asia, watch out. We need to the rich aristocracy of America needs to be selling drugs or selling something to maintain our status of life in the United States. So that was part of why I brought up Roosevelt, just because I don't know how many people.
America is no stranger to being a party to having international drug trade. Is that kind of where this is going? It seems like that's kind of a hot take here. It's is China getting back at the United States and Great Britain for the 100 years that it flooded its country with opium with this whole fentanyl crisis?
Well, and I think it's very important to understand that history of opium wars. And let's think even before opium, it was cotton and tobacco. Cotton is a little less of a of 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 a moral, has less moral issues with it in these countries. But tobacco was the first thing that English lords bought plantations in the South and in Virginia. And some of this, we have this narrative of democracy in America, but in reality it was about the republic. And even these national states that are in a federal union were republican states. And part of that republican power was about maintaining power for agriculture interests. And those agriculture interests were originally for tobacco, and that tobacco was exported around the world. So I just think it's very important to understand that about American history and American relationships with other countries, and especially the very just disgusting policies that the United States had and Great Britain. We were at the heels of Great Britain with the Opium Wars, but we didn't take the moral high road when it came to opium and Asia. And worse than that, we have allowed the American heartland to be the American heartland has gone along with the captains of industry, the captains of shipping, and not questioned what America, what kind of commerce America was dealing with throughout the world.
Along with some of these thoughts, Lucas, what I think of is what some of the problems or some of the issues that come into my mind is just the 4 year span of the United States presidency being so short, and the fact that 4 years doesn't give a lot of time for things to happen, and there's such a stark difference between the Republican and the Democratic parties nowadays, that with every 4 years seems to be a complete 50 degree or 100-degree shift in the way of a lot of things are looked at. And it's not fair to people that are just trying to live their lives. Like, I think about, just 2 years ago, or just a couple years ago, we were reading the news about caravans of thousands, of hundreds of thousands of people coming into the United States. And now all those people created lives, they created families, they lived their according to the rules that was set upon them by a previous administration, that now all completely 180 changed, and their lives are being uprooted because of this president and his policies. And then 3 years later it could be completely different, and they could be almost allowed back in, or I don't know exactly how to say, but the coin seems to flip way too often in the United States for the people that are living in the United States trying to create a life to really deal with it.
Well, and you're absolutely right about that. And that's sometimes people talk about term limits, and I say, well, that will only exacerbate the problem, because the real power, whether it be at the federal or the state governments, are those people who last long enough to span a politician. Because if you think about, the real power of lobbyists is not the money that they're putting in the pockets of politicians. It's the fact that they have an institutional effect on the politicians that come in and out. And so they can create and set up the context for how a politician who's just been elected is coming into an ongoing conversation, an ongoing a fraught conversation. And these are the problems of democracy. So to me the answer is to put governments, to limit governments by jurisdiction and by their powers, and to set governments against each other. And I think that was part of the original intent and design of the United States, but we have not paid as much attention to that as we should. But that is essentially all I have on immigration in California. Grant, I'm running through my mind. There's so many aspects of this that are interesting. I should say, just long story short, I expect I expect the rhetoric to increase, and that the Trump administration, the Republicans, and remember also that the Republicans are not about state rights; they're about defeating states' rights under the aegis of protecting the citizens of the several states and using federal power to do so. So they've always been lined up and to see the world and to understand the levers of power at the federal government to do so. And for them to turn to the military is, is a mixed bag too, because I would be glad to see the United States return to diplomacy and recognize sovereignty of other countries and other regions of the world. But I'm also worried about what that means for political discourse in the United States, because again, with the military, you can send the military in for safety, for aid, for policing actions. But there is always an implicit threat with the military, because that's what they were made to do.
Interesting. We will see you next time on FOMO.